going to call this regular meeting of the Village of Villa Park Planning and Zoning Commission to order. I'm going to start with a roll call. Commissioner Olowski.
Here.
Bello.
Here.
Planenga.
Yes.
Jackson.
Here.
Jarrett.
Here.
Gatto.
Here.
Romano.
Here.
We have a quorum. The first agenda item is approval of minutes for December 14th, 2017. They were in your packet and at your place tonight. So after you've reviewed them, we could have a motion.
Make a motion to approve the minutes of December 14th, 2017.
Support.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Hearing none, by roll call. Orlowski.
Yes.
Bello.
Yes.
Lanenga.
Yes.
Jackson.
Yes.
Jarrett.
Yes.
Gatto.
Yes.
Romano.
Yes.
And I too vote yes. So we have a public hearing this evening, and the petitioner is the Village of Villa Park. It's a proposed Villa Park zoning ordinance. There's an agenda that was, I think, probably out front, and it lists kind of the order that we're going to proceed tonight. Read Village of Villa Park when you see the word petitioner. That's Village of Villa Park. So that's kind of how we'll go through. We'll start with the village and the Director of Community Development presenting to us, and then our consultant. There is a time for you to participate under the agenda, public participation and questions. When we get to that point, we'll have everyone that wants to speak sworn in, and we'll ask you to be careful that we only have one voice in the room at a time. You heard the gentleman from the cable television saying it's very difficult to catch everyone's voice when they're not standing at the podium, so you'll come to the podium. But please be aware that the same thing can happen in your seats. If you're talking amongst yourselves, it becomes very difficult. And we do have a court reporter. This is a quasi-judicial proceeding, so we keep very careful notes. And all that information passes to the village board. As we are a recommending body, they are the deciding body. So that's kind of the general rules and what's going to happen. So we'll proceed. Director Grill.
Thank you. Patrick Grill, Director of Community Development for the Village of Villa Park. I am pleased to be standing before you this evening as you consider adopting a brand new zoning ordinance and new zoning map. As you are probably aware, the current ordinance dates back to 1970, nearly 50 years. It has become what I would consider unwieldy. And you know, given some of the cases that have come before you in the last few years, this process has been arduous, but it was necessary. There was a steering committee that was created. In fact, several members of the Planning and Zoning Commission were on that steering committee. And the document that is before you is one that I believe takes the village into the future. It addressed a lot of the changes that have occurred in development patterns and processes and lays them out, I think, in a much more straightforward pattern. But we had consultants on this project, and they're here tonight, and I'm going to let them tell you a few of the specifics and highlights of what you have before you this evening. And with that, I will turn it over to Kirk Bishop and Leslie Oberhosen.
So before you begin, I'm going to ask that you and your colleague be sworn in. Okay?
Okay.
You can just stay right there. Yeah.
Please raise your hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Kirk Bishop, Principal with Duncan Associates. With my colleague Leslie Oberholzer from Codometrics, we've had the pleasure of working with the village over the past couple of years on this comprehensive update of the village's zoning ordinance and some strategic revisions to the zoning map. Purpose of tonight's hearing. Without getting too far down in the weeds, I'm going to kind of give you some of the higher level kind of changes that are proposed in the draft, reminding you that one of the key reasons for this update is the fact that the village prepared a comprehensive plan that was new in 2009. One of the chief implementation tools or ways that plans and visions are carried out is through regulations and capital improvement programs, but zoning being a key part of that. So with that in mind, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning funded this effort to help ensure that Villa Park, like many of the Chicago area municipalities, continues its legacy of planning and good planning and implementation work. So this was entirely funded by CMAP. We've had the benefit of working with the steering committee, many members of whom are on the commission, of course, over the past many months. We've held a number of meetings. We held a series of open houses in the fall and winter of last year. Unfortunately, as open houses sometimes go, we didn't get a tremendous amount of turnout, so I'm sure that there are some people who are now just learning about the process despite our best efforts and maybe understandably have questions, and we're certainly looking forward to answering those questions tonight about this effort. As I say, many of the key recommendations for changes in the ordinance stem from comprehensive plan policies. I know that many of you were involved, and probably many of the citizens in attendance tonight were instrumental in the meetings that led up to the adoption of the comprehensive plan. The idea of continuing to attract high-quality development to the village, focusing on infill and redevelopment opportunities, creating more of a multimodal environment for people to get about the village by means in addition to the automobile, bicycling, walking, transit, and the like. And then, as Patrick mentions, giving you an ordinance that's not 50 years old, is perhaps better organized, presents information a little more clearly, and it'll be a more durable tool moving forward for you to continue to build upon and amend as times change. For many people in the village, your zoning will remain completely untouched by this effort. The orange, yellow areas on that map, the residential single-family areas, that zoning remains intact. The regulations that were in place the day before the new ordinance is adopted will be the same regulations in effect the day after. There are a few key areas on the map, namely along St. Charles Road, the Villa Avenue business area and the Ardmore Avenue business area, where we have proposed some changes to the zoning that would apply to those commercial or mixed use or multi-unit zone property. And Leslie will talk a bit about that. A series of new MX or mixed use zoning classifications are proposed for that area. So the big ideas in the ordinance are a complete reorganization, reformat, a new way to present the information using tables and charts, and in some cases illustrations and graphics. We've prepared a series of new streamlined procedures for folks who are seeking minor forms of relief, variances from existing zoning standards, many of which, if they're very minor in nature, will be eligible for approval at the staff level without a long, arduous process, expensive applications and hearings. More significant variations and exceptions from the ordinance will continue to be public hearing items and come before the Planning and Zoning Commission and or the Village Board. We have a new use classification system in the ordinance. We present all of the permitted uses in a single table near the middle of the ordinance, relying on broader, more modern definitions of uses that I think will be more flexible for many commercial and mixed-use property owners going forward, and actually open up opportunities for uses that are maybe foreclosed under today's somewhat outdated use categorization system. I'm going to let Leslie talk to you about the mixed-use districts. We've proposed a new public and institutional zoning classification. We have not proposed its application to any specific property in the village, but it would be available in the future to apply to things like schools and churches and government and institutional type uses that sometimes we simply regulate through the same residential or commercial zoning classifications as apply to houses and businesses, when in fact they have very different programmatic needs. And so over time, as that district gets applied to the map, it'll be a more predictable tool. People will look at the zoning map and realize that, oh, there's a school or a park there. It's not necessarily a residential property. Some adjustments to the sign regulations, a prohibition on the box or cabinet signs in many locations is probably the most significant of those, as is a prohibition on tall pole signs in favor of more low-profile monument-type signs would be the preferred approach under the new regulations. And then some update of regulations concerning things like cell towers and wireless technology in light of changes in, mainly in light of changes in federal law. So I know I maybe scratched the surface in terms of some of the questions people have. I think it would probably be most useful for us to, with you, listen to the questions and be happy to respond at a later point in tonight's proceedings. And with that, I'll maybe hand it over to Leslie to talk a bit about what I consider the most exciting and substantive change in the new ordinance, and that is the series of MX districts that are proposed.
So thank you. My name is Leslie Oberholzer. I'm with a firm called Codometrics, and I regularly work with Kirk on more mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented development areas, writing zoning for those areas. The new mixed-use districts that have been developed for Villa Park are kind of on the heels of your TOD districts, if any of you were familiar with that. We created a TOD district for the zoning code. Actually, I did in a previous role several years ago for the Ardmore area right at the station. That type of zoning is what we've now carried over to the Villa Avenue area up and down St. Charles, and then also the Ardmore area right around the library. And the idea behind these new mixed-use districts is that if something were to change in those areas, if somebody were to redevelop one of their buildings, we would have new regulations that would help them to fit within those existing areas. So the new mixed-use districts that are included are, and actually I wish I had the map. I don't think I have the map in this presentation, but are MX1, which is the most walkable and the sort of most intense. And again, that's a carryover from your existing code. That is in your existing code right now at the TOD station, the transit station at Ardmore and the Metro line. MX2 is a new mixed-use Main Street district, and that is modeled after the Villa Avenue area and the Ardmore area around the library. So Ardmore and Park, I believe, right? Is that right? And Central, right. So those areas have a very specific building form right now, and so anything that is new that is built using these regulations would fit into that form better than what is in your existing regulations. So we have created that MX2 district to apply in those locations. It is the most sort of Main Street-like of these mixed-use districts. Smaller scale, again, to fit into those existing buildings. Then we also have an MX3 district, which applies mainly to the St. Charles corridor. We also created an MXT district for the St. Charles corridor, and if you were to look at the map and look up and down St. Charles, you'd see that the buildings that currently are more sort of office-like are falling in that MXT category. So right now, there's one zoning district up and down all of St. Charles Avenue, and it really needs to be broken up into the different types of things that are happening already and to carry that forward. So there's two new districts for St. Charles, the MX3, which is all about shop fronts and retail and personal services and such, and MXT, which allows for some of those uses, but is really meant to accommodate the office buildings and to allow residential development there. The MXR districts are also carried over from the TOD, but there is a lower scale version of that for some of the areas behind the Villa Avenue development, where there was a planned unit development back in there with some townhouses and apartment buildings, and that would also be an MXR district. So that is all located on that proposed map that you see just to the left of the screen. Oh, and look, I do have maps in here. So this is the existing MX1 at Ardmore and the tracks. The proposed MX2 is the purple that you see there at Villa Avenue. And then the, I'm sorry, I was trying to think of the name of the, I'm like, no, the PUD, the apartment building that changed over, Ovaltine. I was trying to say oatmeal, and I was like, not right. Ovaltine. So over there by the Ovaltine site. And then the MX2 at Ardmore and the library area. And then again, St. Charles, which has been broken up into two different districts. The blue that you see on the map is the MXT, and the pink is the MX3. So in the code that you have, you'll see that there's a little table at the beginning of the MX districts that defines 4 building types. These building types are the building form requirements for the MX districts. There's a storefront building that is permitted in the MX1, MX2, and MX3, all of those sort of shopping areas. Then the general building is permitted in the MXT, as well as the 2 residential. That's for an apartment building or an office building. And then the row building is for townhouses or row houses. That is permitted in the MXT and the MXR, the districts, the residential districts. And then we also have a 4th building type, which is a civic building, which is a little bit more flexible for things like the library, civic uses, so that those can be designed with more flexibility. For each one of those 4 building types, there's a set of pages in the document, a spread of 2 pages, like you see up there on the screen. And there are line items that are repeated throughout the different building types, but the different regulations for those different building types are aligned in the columns next to it. There are things like, where's the building located? Where's the parking located? It goes a step further than most zoning regulations to talk about how much glass should be on the front of the building and where the entrance to the building should be. These are the things that are implementing the design of the buildings along your main streets, along Ardmore, along Park, and along Villa Avenue. So there are 4 sets of these in your code, and they're keyed to illustrations at the bottom of the page. And essentially, each one of those 2-page spreads are the regulations for the building type. So if you go to your location in the MX district and you say, I'm an MX2 in Villa Avenue, and I'm going to develop a new storefront in that location, then you would go to the storefront building type, and all of your regulations for that storefront building would be there in terms of locating the building. And the same for all of the other building types. In addition to those requirements, we have a set of general design requirements that are about materials, building materials, and things like balconies that would normally be design guidelines that we've folded into the code. And that's basically the mixed-use districts. Again, those mixed-use districts are only if something is going to be changing in those locations. Did you want to tie up on the process at the end, or is...
Okay.
I do. Probably the biggest emphasis that I can make on this new code is that it doesn't change what you currently have. If you currently have a legal use, the adoption of this new code won't change that. You'll still be able to keep what you have. It's not retroactive. Like the building code is not retroactive. It's everything after this point. It would apply to new developments, additions, and modifications that are made to a specific lot. Then these new requirements that are in this code would come into effect. But I want to make everyone understand, if you're here because you're concerned about the changes, it doesn't change how you currently operate, and it won't force you to change. So I just wanted to make that clarification.
I think there was mention about is there a change in procedure on for variations, that kind of a thing? I think it might be good to give an overview if there is a change, any administrative change like that, just real quick, and then we can go into the public.
Well, I do want to clarify, there are myriad changes in this ordinance.
Sure.
But the process one is one that we worked on very early on, and was definitely viewed by the, I'll navigate my way to I hope I have a slide. Procedures, I think I do. What I referred to very generally in my opening remarks was a new procedure that we're calling the administrative adjustment process. Today in the village, as is the case in most villages, if you need relief from a say you're building an addition to your house and that building is going to go into your side yard so far, but the zoning says, oh, I need to maintain a 10-foot setback from the property line. So you come in to get a permit and you find, oh, I can't do it because the zoning says I need a 10-foot setback and I'm only going to have 8 once I add my building addition. The way you can address that theoretically under zoning is to come before the village. Well, first of all, fill out an application, pay your fee, get on an agenda, wait several weeks, get on a hearing, make your case, and the elected and appointed officials will read the ordinance and determine whether you meet the criteria for a hardship variation or a variation. We've added a new procedure here that should eliminate that rigmarole for very minor things, like a very minor exception to a setback regulation or a parking regulation or some kind of numerical standard, and that we're calling the administrative adjustment. And instead of waiting in line for a long time to get on a hearing agenda, that would be something that could be administered in just a week or two at the staff level if you meet the criteria for administrative adjustment. So that's one of the process modifications that's proposed in the ordinance. The other procedures, those pertaining to how you change your zoning, if you find that something you want to do isn't permitted under the zoning designation that you have on the map, you're, as you are today, eligible to come in and request that property be rezoned. There are some uses that require an extra level of approval that we call special uses. Those procedures remain the same. And I believe most of the other procedures remain pretty much the same. The things that are on this list of items that are provable through that new administrative adjustment procedure are a 10% variation in the required minimum lot area or lot width for your property, a minor reduction in the interior side yard or setback requirements up to 10% or 1 foot, whichever is less. So they're very minor things. They're not likely to disrupt the essential character of the area and are things that are very often approved because they are so minor after you go through the more arduous variation process. So we've proposed here, as we have successfully in other jurisdictions, this new minor you could consider it a minor variance process. We've given it a different name, but that's the idea there. Yes.
On administrative adjustments, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if for some reason they're an administrative adjustment, they were denied by staff, they have the right to appeal to Planning and Zoning Commission, correct?
That is correct. And the neighbors will be notified when an administrative adjustment application is filed. The immediate abutting neighbors will receive notification of the pending action of the staff, of the community development director. And if they too wish to say, I object, this is likely to happen, then that would sort of bump it up to a full public hearing. So in both cases, either the applicant or someone who might feel like they're going to be aggrieved by that decision would be able to find their way back to a public hearing before the planning commission.
Thanks. I just wanted to make it clear that staff didn't
Thank you.
have the final determination in denying something if someone felt aggrieved.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move into the public participation section. So everyone that thinks that they may want to ask a question or make a comment, I'm going to ask you to be all stand up at the same time and we're going to all get sworn in together at one time. We've got one. If you even think you might or maybe you don't know, just go ahead and get sworn in. It doesn't mean you have to speak. I'm not going to force anyone to speak. All right. Looks like we've got, thank you. Okay.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
So we've got a fairly large group. What we're going to do is we're going to ask you to come up one at a time, come to the podium and speak in the microphone so we can capture you for the record. Please state your name and your address before you start speaking. That way we can get you recorded appropriately by the court reporter. You may want to spell your last name. That could be helpful. She's trying to be very accurate. So whoever wants to come up first, please do so. We're going to ask you that in respect for each other that you try to limit your comments to around 3 minutes. We're not going to start timing at the very beginning, but if we see a lot that start to run over, we'll probably start a timer and do that more formally. So we just want your comments to be succinct so that your neighbors will have a chance to speak as well. So please, your name and address.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. I'm Gerald Calcanian of 336 East Central Boulevard, and I've given the correct spelling of my name to our wonderful court reporter.
Great.
Want to wish everybody Happy New Year. And it's a much greater turnout than the Iowa Rec open house back in November, which was also on a cold, stormy night. But I believe I was the only business owner, property owner that showed up because there, the notice in the newspaper showed up 3 days after the first meeting at the library, and that's why that attendance was down. And on ours that night, all the Villa Avenue business owners had met at Moore Brewery for an intensive standing room only meeting. So I think that might have slipped between the cracks. You can see we have standing room only here tonight. Before the 50-year-old 1970 zoning ordinance, before World War II, before the Great Depression, before World War I, before Villa Park, it was even Villa Park and incorporated, the building I'm in was standing as of 1911. So you can see the Calcanians have been here in town for more than half a century, and in fact we were among the original bondholders that got together private money to build the first swimming pool in Villa Park, Lufkin Pool. And without belaboring the point, just to give the bona fides of we're not malcontents, we love Villa Park, and we wish the very best for the village. My brother, Terry Calcanian of 216 South Villa Avenue, is also here, as is Frank Carlson from 212 South Villa. Our little niche at Villa and Central, in other words, we've all pulled together for more than 30 years. When we opened in 1982, there was still the smell of Ovaltine in the morning. What we would like to stress is after actually reading the revision It's not merely a tweaking or an update, it's a complete change of zoning ordinance. In other words, as an experienced real estate attorney of many decades standing, I can tell you that any attorney worthy of his name in DuPage County knows that C3 is the highest and best use for a commercial area, as in your table of uses on page 6/5 shows. And when you compare that to an MX2 zoning proposed change, there's fewer usages that are allowed. That affects the resaleability of the property to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars because, again, an attorney would court malpractice charges if he recommended to a potential buyer to pay the same price for a building in a lawful C3 district as opposed to a legal non-conforming MX2 district. They're apples and oranges. It's as big as the difference between buying a car as is and buying a car with a 3-year warranty. Also, there's some strange, I won't call them biases, but you can see on the pictures on the rear wall, for example, glass block is one of the most environmentally friendly building materials known to mankind. It's warm in the winter, it's cool in the summer, it allows the maximum of light in, and from a security and safety standpoint, it's virtually maintenance-free and vandal-proof, as evidenced by the Ovaltine old courtyard that a lot of people might pass by on Kenilworth and not look at it, but that's hundreds of glass block. Another glaring example is right there at Ardmore in Central, the old Bill Medical Arts building, where again the doctors got together and they decided that that was, from their point, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Aesthetically, they found it very pleasing. Likewise with security grills. In that same portfolio of pictures, they have they want security grills inside the glass doors as opposed to outside the glass doors. And as anyone who knows vandals and burglars understands, why allow that person to break your glass door just to find that, again, they're not rocket science. They don't always think it through that there's a grill inside the door. So what we would be respectfully asking is this is a top-down as opposed to what you folks are normally confronted with, where it's a bottom-down individual petitioner for a property owner asking for a variance. What this does is it's coming down and saying, okay, all of you folks are going to, in the particular areas of the zoning map, be changed, in other words. And as you can see from the turnout, a lot of people are concerned. And again, I reference, because that was a question that was addressed by Kirk, who's a wonderful person, and him and Leslie were very helpful at the November meeting, but when they answered about the variations to planning and zoning, it's not as simple or as possible as it was alluded to. When Jason asked, would that be possible? Actually, if you refer in your booklet to page 11-16, it specifically prohibits Planning and Zoning Commission from allowing use variations. So if someone on a change of ownership wanted to attempt to utilize that variation, now it's no longer legal non-conforming, it's a new use that would then be prohibited, and they couldn't come to you folks for any type of clearance. It's not permitted in the fine print. I'm not going to go into all the different specifics because we're not dogs in the manger. As far as Ardmore Business District goes, in other words, so be it. Let them talk on their own behalf. Or the St. Charles, let them talk on their own benefit. But for the Villa Avenue Business District, at a multitude, over the last 30 years, there's probably been more than 15 different TIF hearings and open houses, everything from the golf course to Wildwood Rec Center, where we were constantly told, you're in a historic area. We don't want a cookie cutter approach. We don't want Brandywine Brown and everyone having their fence their same level. But again, in this zoning ordinance, the proposal is anyone who has residential doors on their building, when a change of use is dictated, they have to go to commercial doors, even if they're having no problems with their doors, and even if it's aesthetically pleasing to them. That's, anyone who's done doors knows that's a multi-thousand-dollar thing. And then when you figure in how many doors per building, it becomes astronomical. What happens in a case like that is the seller might be able to continue his use, because we've got good people. Jan and Patrick are good people, but being here as long as we have, we go back to when Valerie Daner was appointed first Community Development Director, and that's like 3 directors ago or 2 directors ago. So any promises that are made now can be overruled by a simple majority of the board. They're not written in stone because, again, it's a simple majority of the board. That's our government structure. You folks recommend, you can recommend with modifications or amendments, and what we would respectfully request is that tiny little section of the zoning map there at Villa and Central be allowed to remain C3, which it's been for 107 years, in other words, or as long as C3 zoning has been permitted. Because remember, the 1970 revisions or tweak took place, in other words, 50 years ago, but there were other in force before that. I don't mean to be a blabbermouth, and I know there's a lot of other people that are anxious to speak, but Mr. Whitehurst, I commented at in the November meeting, you've been around the longest. You know that what I'm saying is true in regard to this is very unusual coming from the top down, but by you giving written notice, you see the turnout of the people that have come, and we want the very best for Villa Park. We've been here umpteen years. We hope to be here another umpteen years, but we also want to be able to get fair market value if and when we ever sell our property. Me, I would like to be buried on my property, but the idea is that it affects fair market value. It's a tens of thousands of dollar concern, in other words, when you run into these rules and regulations. And you folks on planning and zoning won't have the ability to, if someone comes in and says, can I have this use, you won't be able to approve it. Thank you for letting me take the time.
Okay, so that was 10 minutes. So I just wanted everyone to
I was
know.
also speaking for my brother.
I understand.
Frank, so.
I understand. I just wanted to give everyone else a perspective of that, how much time that was, so that they can kind of gauge their comments. No, it's okay. I thank you for your input, though, and I realize you were representing others, so thank you. Anyone else wanting to speak? Yeah, please. Yes, please. It's okay. We're all neighbors.
All Bill Parker.
That's right.
So my name's Philomena Rodriguez, Rodriguez, and I don't have a business. I own the house on 410 East Wildwood, and so I got this letter about the rezoning, and I don't know what that means for me.
Okay.
Is anyone else like a residential being affected? Like everything I've been hearing is just about business, and so I don't know what this is telling me. Like, are you just taking this over? You're just rezoning the area? It's still my property? Like, I don't understand.
Well, so what everyone said at the beginning is if you're not planning on making any changes to your house, everything's fine, nothing changes. Nothing, the zoning ordinance change doesn't affect you at all. If you're going to make have an addition onto your house, build a garage, whatever, then you'll have to go to the new zoning ordinance to see what applies, what the new rules are that would apply to your, and he's looking at the map real quick to see if he can figure out where your
Yeah, so
house
that's
is.
what I was saying. I was thinking that it said somewhere in here that it was going to be like a bike route or something like that. Like, are you using my property? Are you buying my property?
No,
like, I
no,
don't
no.
understand.
No.
No. The
Okay,
answer's
so what?
no.
I don't know what.
Patrick looks like he.
Property at 410 East Wildwood is actually not being considered for rezoning. It's
There you go.
Okay. And most of the residential districts, the changes are very minor, and I don't want to speak wholesale, but some of them are actually less restrictive. We've adjusted some of the issues on corner lots that allow them
Right,
a little
so that's what I'm
more
saying, why did I
flexibility.
get this letter then? if I'm
Because
not
it's
affected?
part of the official notification process.
And there's a
You're within
distance.
a certain amount of, I think it's within 500 feet of any changes. You
Correct.
have to be
So,
notified.
so the village, especially the districts the gentleman was just talking about, where there is the MX districts that have new requirements, all the property owners need to be notified, as well as from a certain radius around there. So that's why you probably got a notification letter. So it's just all part of that appropriate process that's called for by law.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right.
So she won't be affected. She's right there.
Who's next?
This is Dana.
Go ahead, sir.
My name is Reed Goodrich, last name is spelled Goodrich. And my property is up there next to the train station. And I know the city seems to have had its eye on that for quite a few years back when Gold had proposed some changes and so on and so forth. Now, that didn't come to fruition. But, my concern is I am now an MXR2, whatever that translates into. And that, somehow, in the end game on this is that the city has still got its eye on developing that, and that, the folks that are already there and just going about their business or in some way are going to be forced out. I hate to think that, my place is condemned, so you can put in a Starbucks or something, and put in more businesses, because there always seems to be a tax revenue issue buried in some of this thing somewhere. So, and this is the first time I heard about it. I mean, with the notice that went out. Otherwise, I would have been more than happy to show up earlier and voice my opinion. But yeah, I'm just concerned that somehow this doesn't turn into a larger issue about what the city really has planned for that.
So I think there's a couple things that when the city when Villa Park is looking at ordinances, overlay, changing zoning, the city itself doesn't develop. So it's going to take a developer or someone else coming in, purchasing property, and then applying for new structures, new development in those areas. So there's no action that is necessarily anticipated by the village that they're going to go in and buy property or change.
Well, no, they may not buy it themselves. I know they
Right.
bought the old gas station that was
Correct.
up there. And that may be an exception for them, but clearly I know that the city is in the business of, so to speak, of trying to make, be conducive to developers and so on and help them along.
And where's your property at?
Up next to the train station
Okay, but
on Chatham.
okay. The reason I ask, and I don't know specifically, but most of what is happening in this zoning ordinance related to the train station area
Right.
already exists. There was a TOD overlay done probably 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
So most of what's happening in this update is actually just taking that overlay district and reworking it into the new ordinance. I don't think there are even any changes to the building type styles, maybe some minor changes to uses, but I don't even think that's the case.
Well, just one last thing here.
Yeah,
sure. I see some shrinkage in the lot area or the width and the interiors and so on and so forth. That's something that clearly speaks to how many people you can put in an area in terms of trying to get folks moved in. I without knowing anything more about it, don't see why that would be put in there except to accommodate developers.
This specific slide
Yeah.
is saying that if a homeowner only needs a very small minor variation, they can receive that typically without having to go through a formal process and having to pay for it going through a formal process. So if you're interested in what the regulations are in the zoning ordinance as the consultant was pointing out, there are several pages that will spell out very clearly setbacks, height limitation, area limitation by district. And I think what you'll find is in the TOD, in this MX2, it matches the TOD overlay that was done previously. All right. Other comments, questions? Yes, please.
My name's Anthony Odo, ODDO, 211 South Villa Avenue. My concern is, I have Michael Anthony's Pizza in the Villa Avenue Business District. The area's, really seen a boom lately, which is fantastic. Parking has been a major issue. My concerns are more for in the future, if somebody's going to try to resell their property or business, the parking is going to be affected greatly, I would assume. And I'm guessing a lot of businesses that are there now probably wouldn't be allowed to be in there with the way the parking is being, the way I read it. I might be wrong on that, but that's what I guess my concern is. Just parking is already kind of an issue, and how that's going to change with the zoning. So.
Patrick, do you want to kind of tackle that one on?
I think the easiest way to answer that question is if nothing changes in terms of the use. Ownership can change, but if the use stays generally the same, and you sell Michael Anthony's Pizza and it becomes Jim Bob's Pizza, no changes. No changes. No. Now, if somebody comes in and says, you know what, I want to tear this building down and do something else, well then yes, then the new requirements come into play. Nope.
And Director Grill, can you, it was mentioned, but I think it was maybe not fully understood. Could you kind of explain on a tear-down situation currently in the Villa Avenue District what somebody could do versus what this ordinance is going to do? And I think people will appreciate that right now the character of that district is sort of, it's not being covered by our current ordinance.
Yes, and what currently you could do currently is you could submit building plans that may look, like ultra-modern. Submit those building plans. So long as those building plans met the building code, we would be obligated to issue a permit. What the new code would do is there are design guidelines that would have to be met, but the developer would know it up front. Just like the building code, there would be development standards that they would have to use in their design such to keep it in character with what currently exists in those areas. And that's probably, in my mind, one of the biggest assets that we'll gain out of adoption of this brand new ordinance is more design guidelines that we currently don't have and cannot enforce.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say, so the way I've been up here a long time, as the gentleman said, and it's always been a concern of commissions through the years for a long time that currently, in a scenario, someone could come into the Villa Avenue District and, let's say, buy up a whole block. They could tear down all the buildings, and all they would need is a building permit. Tear down all the buildings, build a building in the middle of a parking lot that's an allowable use in a C3, and there's nothing we could do about it. And they could wipe out the whole downtown. This ordinance and the MX that's proposed, you couldn't do that. You're not going to meet all the bulk regulations, all the requirements, because there's there's area, mass, setback requirements, and everything else. So I think that's an important point to make, that it's not about changing, it's about protecting and then allowing and encouraging further development to occur in a way that's positive for Villa Park and positive for developers.
Right. It's not simply a developer.
Yeah.
If there was a fire and 3 buildings burned down on Villa, they could not, under the current zoning ordinance, be built back in exactly as they are now. They couldn't be built back really even close to what they are now. The requirements for parking, where the parking has to be, the setbacks, all of that would create something vastly different. Whereas this change essentially
Protects the
protects the character of the neighborhood while offering opportunities for better spaces, a little more density, I think, not in terms of, I don't know about the height, but more flexibility in some ways.
So I hope that helps, because that was is certainly the intent, and the consultants were nodding when I was talking back there, so it's not just me that's saying that, I guess. All right, so I hope you don't mind that we're kind of interacting, because several of the speakers have brought up good points that may be common questions or comments, and we wanted to address those. So it's still open for public participation, so yes, please, whoever would like to come up.
I wasn't officially sworn in, so, but I'm an attorney.
Oh, okay.
Donna Kraft Kane. I own the property at 3 East Park Boulevard, but also my mother owns the property at 317 and 320 North Harvard. I did talk to Patrick earlier, but I just wanted to make a little point of clarification based upon something Jerry said and some experiences I've previously had. In your zoning ordinance, it provides for, in the future, I guess if there was a change to that property, that they would extend Harvard Avenue through my parents' property. And talking with Patrick, he said it's a non-conforming use currently because the apartment buildings do not have any frontage. It's been something my parents have owned for years. My concern is I've had problems with other properties in Villa Park that were non-conforming use, and when the people went to sell the properties, mostly were two flats, non-conforming two flats. We had difficulty later on proving that they were non-conforming two flats and we could sell them. Patrick and I have gone through some fun on those properties and we've gotten them through. But as Mr. Kilcanian had pointed out, partly it's because there's been changes in community development. People within the village. We had letters previously from prior community development people, and then those were not honored later on. So even though Patrick has told me there wouldn't be any changes to my parents' property, it concerns me just from past experiences. So I guess I want to make it clear, if you all agree that as long as that property is sold in the same condition, that provision that you have in that zoning ordinance for Harvard and Yale Avenue would not affect the current use if it was sold for the same current use. I guess it's okay, but I don't really see the need of that part within the provision. And also from the standpoint, still as Mr. Kilcaney had mentioned too, on Villa at the Ardmore and Park, I do have some concerns just how some of the parking regulations are written in there. Reality, it is a historical area, and most of the buildings there probably do not have sufficient parking per the ordinance, but yet we seem to somehow get along and make it all work. And I just, if the question is, I guess, is at what point do you say a property is being redeveloped? I mean, when we purchased our building, we had to put in a new storefront. We had some difficulties in getting our permit because we only had one space behind our building. And reading the ordinance, I'm not sure we still wouldn't have difficulties if we sold, we were trying to do something similar today. So I think that's just something I would look a little bit more closely at, the parking in those historical areas.
Okay.
Thank you.
But your general question is what triggers new conformance to the new ordinance on an existing non-conforming or?
Right. Well, the concern is this is like I said, I've had the experience. I have clients who have letters from the village saying their property was a two-flat, as a non-conforming use. It was fine. They needed an updated letter 8 years later. No change to the property. We're being told, well, no, we don't have any proof that it's was non-conforming because we have to have proof from 1930s saying that it was being used as a two-flat there. Luckily, the historical district has been, it's been great. They actually have a lot of documentation. I'm concerned with my parents' property being told it's non-conforming now. And what happens if I need a letter for a lender 5 years from now, and they're like, well, no, the new ordinance says this. You don't have any proof that, you know.
So I think the consultant wants to speak towards that more general issue, I think.
Well, I was just going to say that this is a carryover from the TOD overlay as well. I just wanted to say that this is a carryover from the TOD overlay. So this is that extension of Harvard was in the original. It's in your code right now.
It's in the code right now? Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And related to parking, I know we've had a concern. You mentioned parking as well. I would also stress that, generally speaking, the parking requirements are less parking per most uses now than it was in the old ordinance. This is, it's not 1950, 1960 anymore when we built seas of parking for everything, because we've seen North Park Mall, they've slowly took parking away from North Park Mall to add some very nice amenities at North Park Mall. They have the parking. Additionally, not in terms of not just reducing some of the parking requirements, we also now have a parking sharing section in here, which allows businesses with alternate hours, or like, say, a bank next to a bar. They have very different hours. If they have an agreement to share the parking, then parking could be counted in ratios to both uses. So that also effectively, in some instances, would reduce parking requirements, allowing some uses that might not be able to operate because of parking, but should be able to operate because they would never use the same parking lot at the same time, to now function sharing the same parking lot. We don't want to see, I don't think anybody up here wants to see another development like North Park Mall was when it was built, where it's a sea of asphalt without a tree in it, more parking than they ever needed when it was busy.
Okay, more comments from public? Anyone else? Anyone else? Yeah, please.
Hi, my name's Megan Pingel, P-I-N-G-E-L. I'm from 335 East Kenilworth, Demitos. My question is, okay, so just to clarify, if our business, we have a bar right now.
Okay.
I know everything's the same right now, but if we were to go to sell and the buyer wanted to turn it into an office building, or they wanted to turn it into something else, would they be allowed to do that?
The answer is probably variable. So,
or is it restricted on selling now?
Well,
am I having more restrictions on selling?
It becomes a question of use. So,
yeah. If it's currently a bar and they want to change it to an office, and you're not changing the structure itself, you're only doing interior modifications, it wouldn't require any of the design guidelines or parking that are required in the new code.
Okay, so I'm not restricted in any way of selling the business or the building. Any more restrictions on selling it, on who or what goes into it?
Well, because the village doesn't get involved in the sale of two particular buyer and seller, but if it says you can do it in the code, then you can do it.
So the buyer's not restricted in any way of doing what they want to do at all?
They're restricted to what the code says that they can do.
Okay.
I guess I don't know what exactly you're trying to get at.
No, I just want to know, come time to sell at one point, am I going to have a harder time selling because they're going to be restricted on what I can actually have someone come in and put into the building?
Not any more so than what currently exists right now.
Okay, that's my question.
yeah, the new ordinance, as the consultant was pointing out, has a couple of pages that are uses by district, And that is where you can go to find the information on what are allowable uses in each one of the districts. So, as long as it's an allowable use, you sell to another allowable use, and you don't make exterior changes, you're no problems. Okay, other questions, comments? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Terry Kalkanian, Kalkanian, and I own Unicorn Comics and Cards at 216 South Villa Avenue, right on the corner of Villa and Central. First of all, I want to profoundly state I don't want to be buried underneath my comic book store. But I bought my first comic book there back in 1965 when it was Searing's Drugstore. And it was great to be able to open up in the same place I bought my first comic and later be able to sell comics. As far as I know, I'm the longest running owner of one store at the same location without any other different partners in the United States. I've had two guys research this, and stores have come and gone, stores have sold their name, people have died and they've taken it over. But I opened in 1982, and I believe I'm the longest running comic book store, period. And every once in a while I get some old timers in that might have possibly moved away 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And when they walk through that front door, they see that Drink 7 Up sign down there. And it's been painted over probably 15 times, a bunch of times even before my brother and I have that building. But I believe that sign has been there since at least 1940. I know it was there all through Searing's because I walked through that same door when I was 5 years old, and there was the kick plate. And now on this, us being zoned differently, I believe that that door would have to be changed along with a few other things.
To clarify, just it wouldn't be. These changes aren't going to require anybody to change anything on any building currently existing.
Okay, because, pardon me?
It's just basically what they're saying, is everything's grandfathered in up to this point and starting with new rules.
Yes.
After.
Yeah, so if you were to tear down your building, if a developer bought your property, tore down your building, wanted to build a new, or you wanted to build a new comic book store on the side of your old building, you would have to follow these guidelines, these design guidelines, the setbacks, so forth, just like you would have to follow the existing zoning ordinance that probably wouldn't allow your building to be built at all. You probably wouldn't be able to build anything usable on that site based on our C3 requirements for parking and setback.
So no one would come to you and say, that door needs to be changed?
So that door can stay there for the next how many years, too? So.
As long as it meets the property maintenance code.
Yeah, I've had it restrained, and it's hanging on 3 good hinges. But that's one thing, because a lot of people that come into my store, I know change is most of the time really good, but a lot of people like coming back and just walking around the store and say, hey, the last time I was in here was 1985 or 1983, and it looks great.
Yeah, your store was one of the first stores in Villa Park I went to before I moved here. I love your store.
Thank you.
So,
hopefully
I was on
I treated you great.
Yeah, it's
thanks. And I think I came in at under the 3 minutes.
Okay, you did. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Other comments, questions? Yeah, please.
My name is Mark Vacaris with the Finish Line Car Wash on St. Charles Road. And I'd first like to thank you, the board, for your instrumental help in getting us back up and running there. And also I'd like to thank you for your sacrifice that you guys make in your personal lives, because through the process that I went through, I don't know how you guys can do it. But so I'd just like to thank you for what you guys do. But I just have 2 questions. Like you mentioned, his property cannot be rebuilt. If it burns down, what happens? We're in the same situation. I have 50-foot frontage. I can't build a strip mall with 3 stories of condos on 50 feet of frontage. So what do we do in that situation? It's a catastrophe, but
yeah,
that's what insurance is for.
Right.
But what do we do with an empty lot in town?
Well, you can
He's not
develop it.
selling, he's not selling, so it's a hypothetical. I'm
Yeah.
a car wash, I'm not burning down anytime soon.
Well, but the ordinance is also looking out to the future on development and what the village wants to see happen, and to really inform people on what we want to see happen. In the case of a building that completely burns down and it's a use that maybe was a special use, or, that's a case where you'd have to look at the ordinance, and the bulk regulations for that piece of property to see what the maximum you could build is. And it'd have to be a use that's within the chart for that district. So unless, go ahead, please, come on up.
I am intimately familiar with this provision. I'm glad you asked, because
Sure.
this is a feature of the new ordinance, and it's in fact a change.
Great.
Most ordinances have a provision in what's called the non-conformity provisions that say if a building is damaged or is destroyed to the extent of X% of its value, it can only be rebuilt in compliance with the regulation. This new ordinance says that if it's an accidental damage, if it's storm-related or fire beyond the control of the owner, you can rebuild it exactly as it existed before, as long as you don't create any additional nonconformities. So to that extent, it's a more flexible approach to nonconformities
Thank you.
than is often typical.
I have another question.
Okay.
What's the deal with pole signs? What's wrong with them?
Nothing wrong with existing pole signs, but going forward, new businesses, new uses, new signs, we want to see them as monument signs. And it's just an aesthetic thing.
It's an aesthetic thing that we see common in DuPage County, in our neighboring communities, that they're all going to this. So it's not a unique provision that we made up.
I guess, and the most important part about that is the size remains the same. We're not reducing that at all. It still can be the same size that it currently can be. So.
And also to clarify, it doesn't affect any existing signs. If you have an existing box sign, or if you have an existing pole sign, you're not going to be forced to tear it down. You're not going to be forced to change it. New business comes in, or if you want to put up a brand new sign, that's a different situation. But
Okay. Any other questions? Sure.
So what happens
No,
now?
please, she's got to get your name again.
Okay, Reed Goodrich, I spoke earlier, but
Thank
I'm
you.
new to the zoning stuff. I
Sure.
just kind of pulled into it here. So what happens now? Do you just approve it as is, or do you actually listen to some of the folks and make changes, or?
We have in our agenda, we'll finish public questions, and then the commission members will start to ask questions. People up here will ask questions. We'll have a closing comment from the Village of Villa Park and probably the consultant. We'll close the public hearing, and then we'll have discussion, and we may vote for recommendation tonight to the village board. I don't know. Can't tell you. We haven't got there yet. So, any other members of the public get this?
Can I make
If
one
you
more?
intend to continue it, will you be able to give us notice?
We will continue to a date certain. So we will pick, whether it's the next meeting or 2 meetings out, we will continue to a date certain, most likely, if we were to continue it. Also, so everyone's aware, whatever happens here, it's a recommendation. It goes to the village board, where you would have another chance and time between now and then to review specifics for your property, or generalities if that's what you're concerned about, and then express your concerns to the board as well. And they can accept what we do. They can make changes to any part of this they want.
Yep. Yeah, please.
My name is Kim Krieger, 213 South Villa. With the rezoning and the subclasses in there, does that affect property taxes? Is that going to change, like if I'm an MX3 versus a C2?
No, Director Grill and the consultant are saying, shaking their head no. Won't change property taxes. Anyone else? Yeah, please.
I haven't been sworn in, so.
We'll catch you real quick here.
Joe D'Antonis, 21 East Park Boulevard, 21 East Gallery. Yeah, I just had a question on renovations. So if I do renovate the building, the exterior, I have just siding now. If I change it to brick, does that affect the window transparency requirement of 70%? So if I change my exterior from vinyl siding to brick, say, do I then have to comply with the window transparency requirement of 70%?
Saying renovating an existing building,
Sure,
changes.
where are you located?
21 East Park Boulevard. So it's the MX2, I think, or?
So yes, if
You're
there are
in
some
Park Argus.
line items in the non-conformance section, but if you are renovating the exterior, then you should be following the zoning code requirements. If you are a non-conforming structure, so if the building doesn't meet the building requirements, there are allowances for that, for changes to the building that wouldn't send you. Depends on where the facade is located. If it's located aligned with the other buildings and is in the build-to zone, so it would meet the proposed code, then you would follow the materials requirements for brick as one of the materials.
Because now I think it's 30 to 40% of window area, so my concern was the major expense if I reface the front of the building. And currently don't meet the height requirement. And I just think in terms of change in use, I did have a question. So I sell fine art and antiques. So if I sell this building and somebody wants to put in a small restaurant or cafe, is that change of use allowable so that no change?
Which zoning district
M2?
are you?
I think it's MX2.
He's in the Villa Park News Agency building.
Next to.
So similar to the bar question, maybe more information, what is the change of use? What's the extent of the change of use? Because I'm also concerned with
you're allowed a bar or
resale on the
restaurant?
road.
So MX2 on the chart and the allowable uses, bars and restaurants are in there.
Okay.
Allowable uses. There's actually quite a few uses that are very, my scan was they're most of the uses that we already see presently in that district.
And if there were no proposed change to the exterior, then it's just a matter of an interior building permit.
Well, thanks. And just in terms of notification, I received a notification about this change, I think a week before Christmas or something like that. And I had called, and I guess it was in compliance, whatever the state requirement was. But just as a courtesy going forward, I'd like to get something in the mail 60 or 90 days prior to this. And I think that just as a courtesy, even if it's not a state requirement, because, I was going on vacation for 2 weeks, I get this, and it kind of puts you into some shock and anxiety. Because I just bought the building. So.
Yeah, and I think Director Grill and the consultant were mentioning that they try to do some open house and some other hearing. There was wasn't there some visual preference survey and stuff? Did you guys do that as part of this one? There's some other meetings that were held, so.
I guess the thing, what I was told, well, you could check the website, but I'm not checking the website constantly. So
Right.
Constructive notification is good, but direct notification is better, especially the people in the districts that are areas that are being significantly affected.
Okay.
That's
thank
all
you.
I have, but thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? We're gonna, there'll be another chance, because there's a item called closed public hearing, which is gonna be after a couple of other agenda items. I think we should go into questions by any commission members, because I don't see anyone immediately wanting to jump up. So let's just go into questions by commission members and see what we get for any questions that we might have. If there are any.
I have a question.
Sure.
As someone who wasn't on the original zoning review, Can you tell me a little bit more about the C3 MX2 relationship and how that's a big change, or isn't it a big change?
I would characterize it as a pretty big change, for the reasons that were described. The C3, the C2 and C3 zoning designations are zoning that you might find along North Avenue, Roosevelt Road. And the character of those buildings is really what's possible under C2 and C3. Unfortunately, from a community character preservation perspective, that's the same zoning that's applied along portions of St. Charles and the Villa Avenue. And for most people that we've talked to as part of this process, the character of Villa Ave, South Villa, the Ardmore, even St. Charles as it's transitioning is something that's held in a little higher regard than the auto-oriented development patterns we've seen along Roosevelt and North Avenue. So from a use standpoint, they're not, I wouldn't characterize them as dramatically different, although I don't own a C3 zone property, so it's not for me to say what's an important use distinction. But generally speaking, the MX districts are not about restricting use. They're about focusing more on the physical form and walkability and sort of neighborhood scale building forms while retaining a fair amount of flexibility in terms of use. So it is a pretty big change, but it's not intended to be a change that's simply for change's sake or to impose a whole new set of regulations, but to focus very specifically on those character-giving areas of the community that people hold in such high regard.
Thank you.
Another big, and not a big change, but one of the main changes with uses too is that the old zoning ordinance had list after list of very specific uses broken up into categories, and you had to go from category to category. It would say C3 allows everything allowed in C2, everything in C1, and these things. So you'd have to go back and look at C2 and look at that list of things, C1, long list of things, most of which are terms of a lot of people, like my son wouldn't know what a haberdashery is, but that was a thing. So what this has done is created a chart that was up on the screen with much more general, much more modern terminology. We've updated the uses. So instead of having taxidermy, haberdashery, slaughterhouse, I mean just, you can, we just don't call it a haberdashery anymore. It goes into a consumer shopping goods or whatever the specific category is. So we have more general terms that also allows staff a little bit more flexibility when you have a use that comes, because before, if you came in and you wanted to open a modern use that wasn't listed, staff, depending on who staff was, it was open to interpretation, but sometimes staff would try to find a category that was the closest to your use. Sometimes staff would just flat out say, we don't allow that use, because it wasn't specifically listed, depending on who staff was at the time. This is a much broader range that allows a little bit more interpretation with the modern business world. It's much easier for us to read and staff to read too.
Other commission questions?
I like it.
Hi, well, once this gets proposed, anybody that has like a building permit or has any permits, they still get to proceed with their current projects and finish those projects before the new rules are put into place. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Up until the date of approval, correct, any application that was pending would be under the old ordinance.
That's correct. It's reviewed wholly under the terms of the old ordinance. If you had your application in process prior to the effective date of the new ordinance, you continue under the terms of the old ordinance.
Now, if the new ordinance was more beneficial to what you wanted to do, staff might advise that you wait and apply under the new ordinance.
And that's addressed in, for those of you who want to like to follow along at home. In Article 1, and there's a set of provisions called transitional provisions that addresses your status depending on where you are in the process. It's towards the end of Article 1 or Chapter 1.
Any other questions by commission members? Hearing none, I think I'm going to ask Director Grill, the consultant. I think that you guys wanted to make a final statement.
Only to say that this document will make it, in my opinion, easier for staff, easier for the public, easier for the commission, and easier for the board to make and understand the decisions as it relates to land use and zoning in the village. I do want to make you aware of two changes that will be made when this does go to the board, and that's specifically related, and we talked to it before, 7.76 about inoperable vehicles. We're going to take out the 120 hours just so that it matches what's in the property maintenance code. And the other change that will be made is we are going to clarify that the required parking in single-family residential districts must be within a garage. So it kind of says that. I just want to make sure that it's definitive and that there's no room for any other interpretation on that.
What was that last one? You said any maintenance, would you say? Must be in a garage, or any parking? Repeat that?
No, that the parking, the required parking in a single-family home must be in a garage.
Okay.
Does that mean no street parking?
No. No, you can't. The required parking, there is required parking that is part of any particular zoning district. And in the residential single-family district, what we're saying is you have to have at least 2 spaces. The required parking is 2 spaces. Those 2 spaces must be within a garage. You can still park in your driveway. You can still park on the street.
But
It's just that they're required.
If I were to build a new house.
Yep.
And whatever area is covered by this, if I hadn't planned on putting in a garage before, I'd have to.
You'd have to, correct.
But you would have had to under the old ordinance as well.
Correct. Kurt, did you have any closing comments?
No, I tell you, several people tonight and in the days leading up to today's hearing have asked questions about parking, and those questions really resonate with me. You know, particularly we talk about trying to preserve the character of these, you know, these great community assets, where we're talking about applying this MX zoning, and you know, I think parking is a challenge in those areas, and trying to encourage or require that all, you know, new development take care of its parking on site is problematic. So I'd like to continue to kind of think about strategies for how to address that, maybe full or partial exemptions for existing buildings in MX zoned areas, and other kinds of, as Jason mentioned, we have added a whole lot of flexibility in the parking chapter in this new ordinance, but I continue to kind of noodle about ways that we could go even further and advance some of the goals that we have for these areas and recognize the realities of these small constrained sites. So, and I guess that's a good segue to one final warning or piece of advice I'd like to give you. 3 months after this ordinance is adopted, an issue is going to come before you, and you're all going to be scratching your head and go, didn't we address that in the new ordinance, or the new ordinance didn't quite get it right? I'm telling you that's going to happen. Whenever you do a comprehensive update like this, despite our best efforts and the great contributions of our steering committee, we're going to get a couple of things wrong and miss some items that we should have, and I don't want you being angry with Patrick about
we'll just call you
about
Kurt.
that. And Patrick has us on speed dial, and we'll be happy to kind of continue to think about ways we can address that. But I just want to give you a heads up that don't be frustrated, because those first few months, you're probably going to want to do a housekeeping, kind of an omnibus housekeeping amendment after about 6 months, and maybe for the first year, and then things should be running pretty smoothly.
And I would just say that our old ordinance had gotten so outdated and unwieldy that we saw several text amendments every year anyway to try to keep it up to date. So I'd rather be making a few changes to a better ordinance than continuing to apply Band-Aids to a 50-year-old ordinance.
Yep. Agreed.
And then lastly, just from a procedural standpoint,
yes,
this would not go before the village board prior to February 26th.
Okay.
And then there'd be a first reading and then a second reading on the ordinance.
Great.
So.
All right, thank you. So we're at, if you have an agenda in front of you, we're at F, closed public hearing. So this is the last opportunity for the public to speak before commissioners have our chance to talk to each other about what our thoughts are. So.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Carol Marcus, 221 South Summit. This is regarding residential. I think I'm R1, 10,000 feet, and I'm going to become a RS10. So if I want to knock my house down, I could build a duplex without going to zoning. Page 2-3. Or the recent demolition of 329 South Summit on Highland and Summit. It's a pretty large parcel, 2 double lots. They could build something high on that corner lot.
You're going to go to an RS10?
Well, no, I don't know. It's R1 now. Are the R1s going to go to R10? Nothing's changed?
The R1 will be called RS10 under the new ordinance. They are the same district. Very correctly points out that the minimum lot area in the RS10 district, as is the case in the R1 district, is 10,000 square feet. The use table, however, tells us that in the RS10 district, only one household is permitted per lot.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't be able to sort of add multiples. For every 10,000 square foot of lot area, you don't get to add an additional dwelling unit. You simply get in an RS10 district, one dwelling unit per lot.
So go to the page 2.2, bottom of the page.
Yeah.
Allowed building types. Duplex and multifamily are not permitted. So it's a little bit different than the other ordinance in terms of how it reads, but this is how contemporary ordinances are being written, and it is much easier for someone to follow through. So you can't just maybe necessarily find it just in that one place.
There's a permitted use on RS10 is public and civic building. Does that mean like a church or,
Library.
Yes, church, library,
School.
So I could go from one residence house, no duplex, no multi-unit building, but I could build a public or civic building without any zoning,
as long as it met all the other bulk regulations.
Most of the public and civic use types, schools, churches, and the like, require special use approval. So the building type is permitted. Nearly every public and civic use in an RS10 district requires special use, so you're going to be talking to the Planning and Zoning Commission and Board, which is as is the case today, I believe.
Yeah, and even a large single-family lot's not even going to come close to taking one of those uses.
Well, like I say, the property on 329 Harvard Summit could be something there. Then maybe I would feel more comfortable on page 2.2 with footnote on public and civic buildings to denote that that'd be special use.
It's already in there.
Or is it? Thank you, sorry.
Yeah, like if you, so 6.4 has the chart with uses. RS10, the only permitted uses, permitted as of right without any zoning request in RS10 are one household per lot, small group home, less than 8 people, natural resource preservation, and minor utilities and public service facilities, which that's defined in here, I think is basic with C.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Various essential service has to be in that location.
Right, and then other uses that are permitted as special uses under public and civil are cemetery, community center, government facility, hospital, library, museum, cultural facility, parks and rec, religious assembly, safety service, and school. Those are all special uses. No other uses are permitted in. Those uses actually are identical for RS10 and RS 7.5. When you jump up to RD 7.5 and RM9, then that's where you start to see duplexes allowed in RDS 7.5, and RM9 allows more intense multifamily like apartments.
So we could possibly get neighborhood parks within the neighborhood if a big property becomes available.
Correct.
Sure. Right. Yeah. Please go.
I didn't think I was going to speak, so I wasn't sworn in. Do I need to do that?
Yeah. Let's try to get.
Okay.
Let's try to get you sworn in.
Yeah, that's fine. I do. Yes. I'm Angie Rojek. I own Pioneer Garden on Villa Avenue. I wasn't going to speak, but then you mentioned parking. So I just wanted to clarify how bad the parking problem has been for us. And because you commented that you were going to noodle it around a little bit, I just wanted to noodle it around more than just to make sure everyone knows. Just keep in mind that it's been a huge problem for us. So moving forward, I know I understand what you're saying about that. Obviously, the North Park Mall, there doesn't need to be.
Right.
I totally get that, but I just want everyone to kind of keep in mind what a bad problem it's been, and just keep, moving forward. That I don't know nobody seems to have a good answer for it, but just so you know.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Sure.
Mr. Chairman, just had a clarification on the use table since you're on that page. I was hoping that it might be a typo because for some reason for C3 it's permitted for convenience goods and consumer shopping goods, but for MX1 and MX2 they're both prohibited. In other words, meaning that for MX1 and for MX2 they can't have consumer shopping goods. And then when you read the paragraph defining what that means, Benito time had brought up if a change of ownership, God forbid they should ever have a change of ownership, their food and drinks are great, but say for example they were no longer a bar, they wouldn't be able to open up a bike shop or an art gallery because that's not permitted. So if you keep in the back of your mind that these tables aren't written in stone, in other words, you're able to suggest amendments and whatnot so that the jump from C3 to MX2, for example, isn't quite as large as the consultant, in other words, Kirk, correctly pointed out. It is a big change, and I know that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, but it depends on your point of view if you're the egg type deal.
Right.
So I can't see what would be wrong with an art gallery or a bike shop at the confluence of the Great Western Trail and the Illinois Prairie Path. If you folks remember, we used to have the old Spokes Home, which was kind of a catchy name for the bike shop right there on Ville Avenue, north of Mahoney's. Thank you again for the time.
Thanks for pointing that out. I had noticed that too and was going to mention that in discussion.
Thank you.
Did you want to say something, Leslie?
Yes, that absolutely is a typo. That those two should be filled in. Consumer shopping goods and MX1 and MX2.
I told you.
Kiddo.
Very on the ball.
Great. Good question. Thank you. Okay. Sure.
My name is Waqas Aslam, last name ASLAM, 337 South Ardmore Avenue in Villa Park. So my question is, for example, if I pass down the property onto a family member or my son, or anyone in my family, is that going to trigger any of the changes that we were talking about? And for example, if it trigger, what is going to trigger any changes? Can we go over some of those examples? So.
Change of ownership would never trigger, whether it's through a sale or through inheritance or giving your property away. That's not going to change that. Change of use would change, if you have a use that's a currently non-conforming use, like say you have a bar in an area that doesn't allow bars. I don't know why I picked bars, but that allowed bars but now doesn't, or never allowed bars, but you've been a bar so long it doesn't matter because it's grandfathered in. If you change away from that use, then you would have to, parking requirements and some of the other requirements you would have to meet. You wouldn't have to change the building, you wouldn't have to change the building envelope to conform, but things specific to that use, the use would have to conform.
Yeah, so let's say you sold to someone, they want to turn it into manufacturing.
Sure.
And it's not allowed in that district. Then you're not going to be able to sell to that person, or that person's not going to be able to have that operation in that building.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, and then with you got it. With parking, I want to make sure this is the case in here. I think it is. If parking, if something's currently underparked and they change uses, they don't have to supply all of the new parking, correct? They just have to, like, if it requires 10 spots, the old one required 5 and they only had 3, then they have to add 5 more, right?
That's essentially it, Casey. You essentially get, the old use gets credit for having met the parking requirement. So it's only that increment between what was required for the old use and what's required for the new use that the new user would have to make up.
Yeah, I believe the old ordinance worked that way as well, but that's another thing where if you currently have no parking spaces associated with your building and you want to go to a use that requires fewer parking spaces or the same number of parking spaces, you don't have to supply more. If you go to a use that requires 5 more parking spaces than that use, then you would have to come up with 5 parking spaces.
And there is a new, with regard to parking, I'm reminded of one thing that we added in the ordinance, and that is, going forward, we have a new provision in the parking section we call the alternative compliance section, which is a little bit more flexible than today's variance or special exception process for parking, where an applicant could simply bring in a parking study, some other data, or you could take other factors into consideration and say, you know what, your proposal meets our overall objective. So suffice to say, it does provide a little more flexibility for you all to approve alternatives to meeting the minimum requirements, a little easier path than under today's ordinance.
Okay. So I want to move into discussion by commission members. Unless there's any last comment, we're going to close the public hearing and have some discussion up here amongst the commission members. So, discussion.
You know, one of the things that keeps sticking in my mind is the C3 to the MX district, like you had brought up. And if you look at it from your standpoint, where you know you've been there forever and you'll probably be there forevermore. Right. This really does suit your need well, because if everything around you were to disappear under the C3, you wouldn't fit in. You'd be short parking, you'd be short everything. So if anything, and this was something that we talked about a lot, and it was a way to kind of preserve what we have, you know. So you've heard everything. If your building burns down, you can put it back the way it was. You're light on parking, you're not required to do parking. So it really benefits you, and and even more so for the village. It preserves those areas. So that's something that, was probably one of the more, it was asked a lot of different ways in this meeting, and I think we nailed it. So if we were to vote on this tonight, and seeing the public response, I'm all for everything the way it stands, with the third exception that was brought up, the third change.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some big changes to the ordinance, but as a whole, the ordinance is, large swaths of it are not altered. They are, the language is cleaned up, the terminology is modernized, the way it's formatted is modernized, but a lot of the changes are not to regulations on residential properties or short of these MX districts, which is fairly substantial, but most of the changes are not changes that you could do with your residential property pretty much what you could do with it before. Like I said, we give some flexibility in some places. I can't think of any place where we made residential more restrictive. Did we? I mean,
No.
I know we're under oath here. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a specific.
Corner
And-
lot fences,
Uh,
in side yard, interior side yard, the houses. If there's going to be tear downs and you're going to be building newer houses, going to be closer together because the interior setback allows.
On corner lots, is the interior setback less? I don't know that it is. I know that the outside is, the street side is, for sure,
Well, the
slightly.
fencing height on corner lots have been reduced from 5 feet to 4 feet. And then the interior side yard setbacks, you could have two houses together, and from house to house, or roof line to roof line, it's 6 feet, to the property line. So that might cause some flooding problems, because of the density. It allows single-family homes to be, for infill for single-family houses, you could have 12 feet in between two houses, an interior line. The zone allows that. Before, I thought we had a floating side yard setback that were combined, I thought it was like 15 feet, to give it a little more space in between, as reduced to 12.
I think what Ms. Marcus is referring to is the previous code used to have a requirement that there be a total of 15 feet for your side yards, total. But that one side had to be a minimum of 9 feet and the other one would have to be 6 feet. But the one side would have to be, and that was to accommodate, we had a lot of detached garages in rear yards, so that you had to maintain at least 8 feet just to get a driveway back there. Since now we have a lot of homes that have attached garages, we don't require so much of a side yard in those particular instances, and it's 6 feet on each side, 12 feet. Now, again, that wasn't to create additional density because the lot sizes are still, the minimum lot size is still the same as what they were. It just recognizes the fact that, and that's just a minimum. You can have more than that if you want, and if you still want to have that drive to your backyard, you can do that. But that's, I think, what you're trying to refer to. It doesn't increase density.
And to clarify on that too, there's currently nothing in the current ordinance that would keep two properties from having their driveways on the opposite sides, meaning they're two 6-foot minimum side yards abutted.
Correct.
which is what this is. So there's nothing to keep that.
No, it allows minimum, well, maximum, it could potentially allow 12 feet in between two houses. I mean.
But that's currently possible under our current ordinance.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if every house was set up the same way, so that 9 feet was on this side and 6 feet was on this side, that wouldn't happen. But that's not a requirement of the current ordinance. You could have driveways together, driveways flipped, so those 6-foot side yards still abut. I mean, it happens in many places.
But you could have, if you're building something and you could have 6 foot house, 6 foot house, 6 foot house, and then if you have front loading driveways.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, you can currently. Okay, other discussion?
I don't know, I was looking at it, I don't know if it's a typo or it's just my printout didn't work, but, I don't know, was it, page 6.3, section 6.1C? I just have a blank, I don't know if that's a big deal or not to you guys, but I don't have a blank circle, I don't have anything there, if we want to correct that. It's
Yeah,
my mistake.
oh, use identified with that's a circle with, that's a.
Circle, empty circle, right?
It's supposed to be an empty circle.
All right.
Yep. Because when you go to the use chart, there's a whole circle, a half circle, and an empty circle.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I think, like I said, I've been up here a long time, and I can remember when we tried to do an overlay district to protect the Ardmore Avenue district and the Willow Avenue district. And parking came up as a concern then, and it's coming up as a concern now. I think now it much more so is meaningful because we're really seeing just a great time in the Villa Avenue district with some exciting businesses that have come in, and I see that even in the businesses that have been there, I see more traffic. I certainly hope that those businesses are experiencing that, and there's a new sort of life downtown that there never has been, and I think this ordinance will go a long way to continuing that and really make it a much stronger area while maintaining its character. And I think that's a real need that we've had for a long time. We've also had a need for a very long time to have an ordinance that has been gone through by a consultant. It meets current standards, it meets current interpretations of zoning, and it's also reflective of maybe incorporating some upgrades in our language so that we're very clear. Staff should be spending less time clarifying or restating things that they've known for a long time that the ordinance states, but in terms of how they've interpreted it, but it hasn't been apparent to developers and the public. And anytime you can make something clear and articulate it out there to the community, I think it's going to be amazing at what we're going to see in terms of people coming in and being able to realize what a great community that we have and what our ordinance allows. So I think for all those reasons, this is a very, even though there are large changes, the changes are really so that we can protect what we have and see that go into the future and become a real strong point for our village. So I'm excited to see this come down. I'm excited to see some appearance guidelines as well, so that buildings that are going to get done in this district, this commission fights a lot or works a lot in conjunction when we see new development come along to try to make it be the best that we possibly can. So to have something in writing that we can point to that says it's in the ordinance as opposed to it becoming a negotiation with us or the board is so helpful, because that's a tool that we can all use to make sure you as a community get the best development, the best buildings that we can get, the best, the most convenient, everything else. So for all those reasons, I'm excited about it and, want to see it get adopted. Of course, there's going to be, as the consultant said, we're going to have a trial run period with it. There's things that were pointed out tonight. So please continue to interact with staff and the board. It's going to be before the board 2 times, as staff stated tonight. So if you have concerns or you read it more and you have comments, they're going to love to hear what you have to say and want to make it so that it works for everyone. But at the same time, there's some principles and ideas in here that really I think a lot of the community has embraced, and I think the consultants have done a good job of making something for Villa Park. It's not just bringing in a boilerplate that comes from somewhere else. It really reflects us as a community. So that's my 2 bits on it. I don't know if anyone else has any more comments.
I'll make a comment. I was on the steering committee. I think we worked on it for 2 years. The biggest comment that I'll make is we took the village in a whole, the business districts in a whole, to heart when we did this, to try to preserve everything that we do have, but bring it up to today's standards without destroying it. And that was some of our concerns moving forward in this, was to try to make sure that we preserve what we have. And not, I mean, being on the board that I am now, in some of the businesses, you're watching what businesses want to move into your town, and then you're asking questions right away. Well, where are they looking to move? Because with the way some of our ordinances were, there was a lot of places that they could have moved that would have really broke down the structures that we have. So with this, I think it really puts some fine lines down to preserve the areas that we have, and keep them the way that Villa Park wants to keep them.
Right. Our comprehensive, when we did the comprehensive plan, which was 2 years of work, I think, there were areas identified almost unanimously as parts of the village that we wanted to preserve as a village. There were also areas that were seen as areas of opportunity for new development, modern development. This, under the current, the old zoning map and the old zoning ordinance, other than the TOD area, by and large, those visions weren't possible. This allows an opportunity to preserve those areas that we want to preserve, while in many cases offering some additional opportunities along parts of St. Charles, which was part of the comprehensive plan. It brings the TOD overlay into the zoning ordinance rather than being a standalone piece. But I was on the steering committee as well, and there are going to be things in here that we find that need to be changed from time to time. But it should evolve. But I would rather it evolve from a modern standpoint than a 50-year-old standpoint. Also, I had another point that left my mind.
So while he's thinking of his point, I have a question for Patrick, which is, do we need to itemize some of the adjustments that you and the consultants talked about, and we've talked about the typo, or is it more a general statement that we need to make in our motion?
We could do it just by a general statement in the motion. It doesn't have to be precise. So
it's the right answer.
I did. The other point that I was going to make is there is still a variance process. If you need a variation for a property, that still exists. So if you have a non-conforming property now, or a property that was non-conforming before, there are ways to deal with that. Also, Mr. Kalkanian mentioned that there's no use variance. We've never had a use variance, and very few zoning ordinances allow for variations of use. It's potentially very dangerous because it allows elected officials to put uses in places where the planning officials and staff might not approve of by a simple vote. as opposed to trying to approve a text amendment, which is really the only way to change a use. If there's a use that's missing that you think should be allowed in a district, you can come before the board. You can come before us and say, I think this use should be permitted in that district. I think you guys missed it. And we can address that as
But it's not allowed in the new zoning ordinance.
no, see, a use variation is not permitted. But what is permitted is a text amendment to the ordinance. So while I couldn't say for your specific property, we don't allow slaughterhouses on Villa Avenue. Slaughterhouses is one of my favorites. We don't allow slaughterhouses on Villa Avenue, but you know, I like these people.
Temporaries for
Right.
feed times are permitted.
But I say, you know what, Mr. Kalkanian, I really like you, and I want you to have your slaughterhouse. So I give your specific property permission to build a slaughterhouse. That's not permitted. What would be permitted is for you to come before the board, this commission and the board, and say, I think a slaughterhouse should be permitted in all C3. And then as a village, we discuss, is that a use we want in C3? We decide no, because a slaughterhouse is in C3. But if it's a use we missed that should be in that district, we're not going to grant permission to one single property to do it. But we can make an amendment to the ordinance that would apply to all property in that zoning use, that zoning district, so it's fair.
With the consumer shopping goods, that even though you're going to have a general statement, by having a written record by the court reporter, you'll catch all those I think,
Correct.
3 or so amendments.
Correct.
Yeah, correct. That's this kind of thing that, let's say this had gone to the board and got approved without that catch, and you would come back to us and said, you know, that's missing. As a board, we could say, yeah, I think that should be in all C3. What we can't do is say, your property and only your property can have that use. That's what a use variance is. It's specific to a single property, not a zoning district as a whole. So, I hope that alleviates some of your concerns in terms of the uses. Because it doesn't mean uses can't be permitted that weren't before. It just means on a case-by-case, site-specific basis, it can't be done.
All right. So, if there's no other comments, which there can be, but if there's no other comments, we could have a motion. And I was just clarifying from Director Grill that we don't have to be, have specificity to say that we would move to recommend approval, given some of the edits that were discussed tonight and are part of the record, as our neighbor pointed out. So.
All right, I would like to make a motion to recommend approval of the proposed Villa Park zoning ordinance as viewed this evening with changes as were brought up during our discussion.
Okay. We have a motion. Is there a second on that motion?
Oh, and I need to amend my motion. I apologize. To include and approval of the zoning map presented to us tonight.
I'll second that motion.
Second that motion. Okay. Any questions or comments on the motion? All right. By roll call, Commissioner Lulowski,
Yes.
Commissioner Bello,
Yes.
Lanenga,
Yes.
Jackson,
Yes.
Jarrett,
Yes.
Gatto,
Yes.
Romano,
Yes.
and I do vote yes. With this, our recommendation will pass to the village board. They can either accept, reject, or modify. And as staff stated, I'll say it again, it will be up two different times and no sooner than February 26th. No sooner than February 26th. Okay? Thank you all for coming and participating. We really appreciate it. We don't often get this kind of a crowd, so it's great to have an interaction, so thank you. We do have a couple more agenda items that we have to go through to finish up, so if you can exit as quietly as possible, we'd appreciate it. All right. Director Grill, when you get a moment.
Thanks.
Take care.
Director Grill, could you, so we can finish up and then we can have discussion. Okay, we're still finishing up here, so that's all right. Thank you. So, upcoming public hearings, I see there's none.
We have none.
We have none. And so there's no briefing on village board actions and related matters?
Other than I did want the commission to know that in addition to being named the 28th best community to live in Money Magazine, we've also been named the 8th best community to raise a family in.
Awesome.
And the village is putting together a celebration. I think we're trying to have that celebration on April 28th, just for that designation. But what I
designated us that?
Yeah, right. What's that?
Money Magazine.
Money
Magazine.
The same
Yeah.
one, Money?
What's that?
Both designations, money?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, both of
okay.
them were money. Yep.
Great.
But I also wanted to bring to your attention the fact that there is going to be a volunteer appreciation event on Friday, February 23rd.
Okay.
And that's for all commissions and volunteers of the village. It's not a business thing, it's strictly a social function and a way to give back for all the work that the commissions do for the village.
No,
but that'll be scheduled for Friday, February 23rd.
Okay, thank you.
And where's that going to be? They don't know yet?
What's that?
We're going to hang out here?
It will be somewhere in the village. It won't be here in this room.
All right, that's a good thing to know.
All right, so any commissioner comments?
I do have a quick comment, relatively quick.
Okay.
So, some of you probably heard that the village is probably going to get rid of Lufkin.
Yeah. Yes.
The village, it's okay. The village will probably be closing Lufkin Pool. There was a vote not to approve funds for a repair. And I know that there's, the village itself has ongoing plans to try to figure out, what to do with the future, because Jefferson Pool is also nearing the end of its lifespan, I believe. Repairs there are pretty expensive and needed. So the question that I would have, and nobody has to have an answer tonight, but do we have a role as a planning and zoning commission on what the future of facilities might be? Do we have a role in trying to determine, is an aquatic center something that the village wants? What's the location for it? I know the village has its own thoughts, or trying to get to a point where they can have those thoughts, but do we have a role? I don't think anybody needs an answer tonight, but just some food for thought.
Well, my understanding from the circular that was sent around to all residents, I think, is that there's been a study being done or been done in the past, or maybe 2013 study, and it identified a potential site on the handout for Lions Park. I think, my initial reaction was that, not seeing the study, was that's not a very big park to put a lot of use on. That I think is a great use, and it's something that we it'd be great to have. But so I don't know if planning and zoning has any say in that, or just us as residents, if there's more opportunity to interact going forward. That's really would be my question, just the same way that citizens interacted with this process.
And the only thing that I could say tonight is that there'll certainly be more opportunities for interaction and input on any potential facility or location. And B, I think regardless of the facility or the location, it's going to have to come to us for consideration.
Right, and I guess that's kind of my point, is that it's something that's ultimately probably going to end up before us anyway. So not today, not tomorrow, not next week. Is there a role for us in workshopping that to some degree? It's something that we would need consensus of, we'd need to talk to staff about, but just food for thought. Because I think we've got a lot of minds up here that
Yeah, well, and
might
I
have
think
some ideas as well.
2013 study it needs to be updated anyway. I'm sure that's what the board is
Right.
thinking, yeah.
Right.
And what I can do is I can pass along the commission's desire to offer their assistance to workshop any ideas or plans that are put forward.
Yeah.
And I think it would be well received by the village, so.
Great. Okay. Any other comments?
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least mention the fact that these guys worked for 2 years on this
Yeah.
zoning. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. And the knowledge that they have exhibited and sharing stuff is amazing, so thank you.
Yep, thank you all.
I think I read this thing 5 times, something like that, but I read a little less of it each time, thankfully, because you knew where the changes were coming.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I agree. Thank you all.
Amazing.
Director Grill, the consultants, great job. So, all right. Nothing else. I'm going to say
Motion to adjourn?
motion to adjourn.
Aye.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Adjourn.